Those of you who do not know me, my name is Nick Stallman. I am the wildlife habitat educator here at Audubon, Western Pennsylvania. And one of the main things that I do is our certified backyard habitat program. So I know some of you are enrolled for this year, and I recognize many of you from previous years. So thank you for coming on here. Today, we will be talking about invasive plants, primarily what they are, why we should care about them, and a little bit about the identification of some of the species that we commonly have here in Pennsylvania. I will be recording this, and as far as if you all have any questions, we have a fair bit to get through, and I know the last time I did this, we ran a little long with questions. So if you have questions, throw them in the chat. We'll try to address all of them at the very end. So if you have one at that time, just go ahead and put it in the chat, and I'll kind of go back up and go through it near the end there, just to make sure that we get through all the material and people can get out of here on time. But with no further ado, let's go ahead and get started here. All right, well, first off, we're going to talk about what are invasives, and if you were on the winter ID one, it'll be very similar to that. And then why we should care, what's the problem with them, all that kind of stuff. Then we'll go into some management resources before we go into ID, because I know a lot of you, the main questions are what I can do to get rid of them, what I can do to control them. So I really want to stress what resources are out there and are reliable for control of a lot of these species that we'll talk about today and the species that we do not talk about today. And then we'll actually look at some ID, and this is going to be what to look for, some of the confusion species, including some native plants that will look like the invasive plants, and then a couple of potential management options. But again, the biggest thing will be going back to those resources that we'll talk about at the beginning. And then we'll make sure to have some time for questions at the very end here. Move this chat window. All right. So up first, this is the nice big long definition of what exactly invasive species are. So I know it's a wall of text courtesy of the United States Geological Survey, but they have a really good definition here. So we're just going to piece it apart. Invasive species are going to be introduced non-native organisms. So something that was brought from one location, usually from one country to another country. And then it begins to spread or expand past that range where it was first introduced. And this is most of the time on its own accord or with help from animals or human activities. And then once it spreads, it has the potential to cause harm to the environment, as well as the potential to cause harm to the economy or human health. But for this talk, we're mainly talking about the plants that will have an impact on our natural environment. Invasive species aren't just plants, so that does include mammals, insects like spotted lanternfly or hemlock woolly adelgid, invertebrates like some crustaceans, some snails, mollusks, as well as diseases that were native to a specific range that could impact trees. Like this is a beech tree on the far right here. This is a disease that impacts the bark. We also have a disease from Asia that is impacting some European salamander populations. This salamander down here shouldn't have these little black dots. That's being caused by a disease that's kind of eroding away the skin. So there are a variety of different things that could be invasive species. And in particular, today, we're just going to be focusing on plants. And one of the most common questions I get is, are invasives weeds? Weed is kind of a weird definition. There really isn't a botanical definition for a weedy plant. It's more or less a plant growing in an area that we don't want it to grow, or an individual doesn't want it to grow. So to some, dandelions and violets in a turf lawn are going to be weedy. But to me, that's something that I don't mind having in my lawn, so they're not really weeds to me. So invasives are kind of weeds, but not all weeds are invasive plants. In fact, some of the plants that we think of as weeds are native plants that belong here. They are plants that are beneficial and grow readily in urban environments. Things like pokeweed is a native plant that many would consider a weed, but it is not, and it's not really invasive. But As far as like why invasive plants are concerned, is they tend to have a few um, natural adaptations that allow them to outperform some of our native plants here, including some abundant seed production. Over here on the left, some of you might recognize these seeds from the tree of heaven. And one tree can produce like hundreds of thousands of seeds every year. The one on the right is called Princess Tree, Polonia tomentosa. This has capsules that form on these stalks, and each stalk will have multiple capsules. And from there, you will have like 20 million seeds across a single tree. So there will be very abundant seed production. And a lot of times the animals really love to eat the berries on these, which, maybe there's some nutrition there, but the primary concern is that if birds are eating these privet berries or these honeysuckle berries, the seed tends to survive their digestive tract. And once it comes out the other end, it has a little bit of fertilizer and it will just germinate very quickly in a new area. And so that's why a lot of times you see these invasive shrubs and some other invasives growing on fence lines or hedgerows because the birds are perched on that. They're dropping the seeds. So abundant seed production and animals find them appetizing to spread them can be kind of a problem, combined with the fact that some of these are allelopathic, and allelopathy is a plant that produces some sort of chemical that inhibits the growth of other plants. So tree of heaven and garlic mustard both exhibit some form of allelopathy that prevents other things from growing in the area. It's just them. So you end up with dense stands of just garlic mustard or just tree of heaven. And if they don't have those traits, many invasive plants will just be generalists and they thrive wherever they land, wherever they want to grow. And all this combined together will just lead to increased competition for natural resources with native plants like sunlight as the plants start shading each other out, increased competition for moisture and nutrients and just generally space. This will also lead to increased soil erosion, which is counter intuitive to why we brought some of these invasives over. We find that things like kudzu or knotweed grow really quick, or tall fescue grass grows really quick, and we can use it to stabilize areas. The problem is that their roots aren't that deep. And so if all is growing in that area are these plants, we find that that soil gets very, very eroded during storm events, especially knotweed. There's significant evidence that banks that have nothing but knotweed will have full degradation events where like banks collapse because their roots are very fragile. The monoculture doesn't allow for secure roots to take hold. Um, Stream erosion or soil erosion is going to lead to degradation of water quality, as well as some invasive plants are aquatic and can impact water quality. In general, this is going to be pretty poor wildlife habitat. So all wildlife needs food, water, cover, and space. And invasive species can kind of impact all of these with the food that they provide not maybe having as much nutrition as a native counterpart, or the cover that they provide is just not suited. Maybe if a bird lays or if a bird makes a nest in bush honeysuckle, there is a higher chance for nest predation because the structure just isn't very good and predators can get to the nest easier. So we do see degradation of wildlife habitat with more invasives and just an overall decrease in biodiversity. Invasive species have contributed to the decline of, I think it's around 40% of the United States threatened and endangered species, with 18 having direct relation to an invasive species. These studies basically just show a decrease in faunal diversity, from less salamander abundance in forests that have winter creeper or English ivy ground cover to just less insects in areas that are primarily in non-native invasive species. This can lead to a lot of economic losses. There's been a lot of studies that have tried to put dollar signs onto how much is lost. Some of this is going to be coming from agricultural practices. Some of this is going to be coming from water treatment facilities or even like job losses from decreased forestry production um, and damage to like infrastructure for outdoor recreation. But these are the main concerns when we think about invasive species and their impact on the environment. And in Pennsylvania, we have about 140 different species of plants. They rank them from like just being on a watch list in that they're invasive in nearby states, or if temperatures continue to warm every year, they might get here and they could prove to be a problem, or they are already here, and if the climate changes enough, they will become a problem. To lesser threats, significant threats, to severe threats, which are just species that have invasive traits, spread easily, will displace plants, and they are here. So we will go ahead and jump into just some ID for some common species. But before that, I really wanted to talk about some of the management resources because, again, I know a lot of people are wanting to know what to do about these. And there's two in particular that I just want to go ahead and make sure that you're familiar with. The first is going to be the Penn State Extension's website. This is going to look like this guy right here. If you went to their main page, you can use their search bar up at the top here. And for instance, we could search for Tree of Heaven and it'll have a little drop down box, or you can just hit the search bar. And if you scroll down, eventually you'll see one that's an article. These articles are going to be super, super informative. They're going to go into background of how this species got here, and then significant amount of identification with a lot of photos, a lot of tips. So if you're unsure on ID, they'll go into some lookalikes, how this species is dispersed either by animals, by wind, by people, and then it goes into control. So here is going to be a very well put together resource of physical control methods as well as herbicide control methods, what the proper techniques are, what the timing of year is. So these are going to be very, very informative. This is going to be tied to the specific plant. It will have links to some of the techniques. So if you were to click on this hack and squirt herbicide application, it will bring you to the hack and squirt article talking all about that technique and how to do it properly. And then at the bottom, they have these awesome little management calendars. And then they go into a bit more detail on the timing, some comments about the herbicide use, and all of that. So if they have an article on an invasive species, the Penn State Extension will have done a fabulous job on these. And this is kind of a blow up of those management calendars. So for a given species, it will say, all right, this is when the seeds germinate, or this is when it has the rosette stage. If this is a biennial, maybe this is the treatment window that you can do certain things. So polling is effective from April through June in its second year of life. Or down here, it's some sort of shrub and it tells you when it's leafing out, which is from March to April. So flowers and seeds are ripening kind of mid-May through summer. And then foliar application, so spraying the herbicide on the leaves is effective from this time, but basal bark and cut stem, which we'll talk about in a second, is effective year round. So all of these are going to be very, very great. They're not going to have an article for every single invasive species in Pennsylvania, but for the most part, they have very, very good articles on the most common. And from there, if they just don't have much of anything, you can check the Pennsylvania Department of Conservation and Natural Resources, the DCNR. They have invasive species fact sheets. So these are 1 to 2 pages long, and it's more or less a condensed version of that Penn State Extension article I just showed. So it will go into a little bit of background, a description, what parts of the state that it was currently in when these articles were made, and what are the control methods. So usually at the very back, it will have it as physical control methods if there's an option for physical control, and then an herbicide control option. And they will go into some details about techniques on these as well. So these, they have articles for most every invasive species. So if you don't see something on the Penn State extension, definitely check out the DCNR's invasive species fact sheets. And I'll have links for these that I'll send out to everybody when I send out the video for this talk today. All right, so now we'll actually get into this. And we have up first, Tree of Heaven. So I know a lot of you are familiar with this one. For identification, the leaves are going to be pretty helpful in the springtime. The bark can also be pretty distinct from far away. So when it's around this size and even bigger, it just has this grayish, dark grayish bark with these jagged lines running through it that's reminiscent of cantaloupe, is how I think of it. So if you see this bark, that's when you can get closer, try to make sure of the other ID characteristics. So once we have leaf out, leaves are pretty good for ID. Unfortunately, they can be confused with other things. So the leaf of Tree of Heaven is over here on the left. It is a compound leaf, which means this entire thing from top to bottom here is the leaf comprised of multiple leaflets. Unfortunately, black walnut is also got a similar compound leaf, and so do our sumacs, staghorn sumac probably being the most common. So how do you tell these apart? Well, you just get a little bit closer, and you're going to notice that the Tree of Heaven has teeth at the base here of each of the leaflets, especially near the very bottom. So sometimes they'll have two, but it'll at least have one at the base of the leaflet. If you were to turn that over, they have what's called glandular teeth. So there's this little pimple on the underside that will sometimes looks like it's already burst and have that gray dot at the center. Other times it's just a green pimple. So if you got close enough to turn that leaf over, you'd see that little dimple right there on the underside tooth. And while you're that close, go ahead and crush a couple of those leaves. And if it smells foul, to me, it smells like rancid peanut butter. If it has that smell, you got Tree of Heaven. So Tree of Heaven kind of smells, has like a weird, musty peanut butter smell. Versus black walnut, if you were to crush that leaf, it's kind of got that sweet, citrusy walnut smell. And sumac just doesn't really smell like much of anything. Now, again, we got these glandular teeth and that nasty peanut butter smell, and you'll smell that on the crushed twig as well. So if you were to break a twig. For management, pulling these out is really only effective if it's a seedling, like a 6 to 8 inch tall seedling that's not coming from a larger tree. So that's really the only time that you might be able to pull these out. Otherwise, I would highly recommend consulting that Penn State extension article where it will go into some serious detail on how to effectively control this with minimal targeted herbicide treatments. These treatments can be done from mid to late summer when the juices are flowing in this tree, because one of the best ways is this hack and squirt method. So that's what's being pictured over here on the right, is where you're going to take a hatchet and you just hit into the bark. The live tissue is just under the bark. So you just need to cut a little bit, and then you spray the herbicide directly into that wounded area. This will cause the tree to suck up that herbicide and bring it to the parts, so it will kill the tree with, again, very minimal herbicide. The problem is if you were to just cut this down, not use any herbicide treatment whatsoever, you will get stump sprouts. You will get root sprouts, and it will keep going. There will be a lot of energy still in these roots, and the moment it leaves out, it's putting some energy back into those roots. So this can be a fight that never ends if we don't use a little bit of herbicide on these. So again, I would highly recommend consulting Penn State Extension for very specific techniques as well as what herbicides are the most effective and what timing of year. The next one, so that was our invasive tree that we're going to cover, and then we're going to talk about a few invasive shrubs. Up first is privet. This is actually, there's like four or so species within Pennsylvania that are considered invasive. Functionally, they're the same. If you're curious about ID, a lot of the times it comes down to where the flowers are growing and sometimes the shape of the flowers or the glossiness of the leaf. But we have a shrub with these little oval like leaves that are opposite. So that means that they are growing kind of right across from each other. And we have these panicles of flowers. So one of the more common ones that we see, this I took this photo, or not this photo, this photo just recently. So these are blooming. Right now. You can go out and see them. They're these four-petaled white flowers that form into clusters. And a lot of the times they'll be right at the outer edges here. There's one species that only kind of blooms at the terminal twig over here. But again, we got opposite growth, four-petaled white flowers that grow in big clusters. If you were to look down a little bit onto the lower branches, you're going to see these thorns, which aren't really thorns. These were actually previous year's twigs that have fallen off, leaving behind the broken base that's thorn-like. So these will be kind of a blunt-tipped thorn. Sometimes they'll be all up and down the lower branches on these smaller shrubs. And again, this is actually the twig that has fallen off, and then the growth, new growth is still up here. The flowers do produce these purple drupes, so they're berry-like fruits here in clusters. They will persist pretty long. Birds do eat these up readily. They will, if they're not quite ripe, they'll persist through the winter. So sometimes you will actually see these fruits still being around when it's blooming. So you can use both of those to ID it with the little small four-petaled flowers and the purple drupes combined with this nice opposite growth. I will say sometimes this is what's known as semi-opposite in that as you get closer to the terminus of the twig, it might look like the leaves are alternate, but usually at the bottom, the mid to bottom, they're very obviously opposite leaves. Then the bark. So for confusion species, some of the native shrubs that you might get the opposite leaves confused with are going to have very rough bark versus the privet's smooth bark. So this bark is fairly distinct even from far away. This can get pretty big. So a lot of times we think of privet as just these scraggly shrubs that are all along the edge. Left alone, they can get pretty thick. So they're almost like understory trees when they really have time to grow out. For management, this is another one where seedlings, you could pull them out. You can try to dig out the bigger ones or use weed wrenches or pull bearers, these guys over here, to pull out the bigger ones, but they will resprout from those fragments. So you have to constantly keep an eye on that area. Herbicide treatments are fairly effective. You do need to follow up. This is one where you could do the cut stump. So that is where you just cut it down to a stump, and as soon as you cut it, you're applying herbicide to just the outside of that cut stump because that is where the living tissue is. So we don't need to waste herbicide and add additional herbicide to the environment by painting the center of the stump because this is just dead wood. It's not going to transport any of that. So the cut stump method is where you're just applying it directly to the outside living tissue here. Also, if you need one of these pull bears, if you've got a lot of invasive shrubs that you want to work on, privet, these are good with bush honeysuckle too, and you're gonna kind of keep an eye on that area afterwards. What they do is just give you an extra, it gives you a lot of torque to just rip this stuff out of the ground. We do have these. If you would like to borrow one, just email me and we can set that up. Another shrub, this is, now we're getting into the ones that are still planted. This is a noxious weed. So Japanese barberry is a noxious weed in Pennsylvania. You can't buy this or sell it. However, there are like four cultivated varieties that are allowed to be sold. They're infertile and seedless, so they're supposedly safe. They can't cross with anything. Yeah. But this was planted as an ornamental. This and I think the next one I kind of consider the McDonald shrubs. They're pretty much in every fast food hedgerow there is. They've got the fall color, but most of the time when they escape or we don't trim them enough, they just look like this scraggly little thing over here on the left. For identification, their leaves have these, it's an oval shape, almost like that privet. It's not as glossy, and it comes to, it tapers closer to that twig. So it's got this very unique shape, and they also have these terrible hypodermic needles for thorns here. These are very painful, and the leaves tend to do a really good job of hiding them. The leaves also do a really good job of hiding all the ticks that love this shrub. If ID is still questioned, this does have like a vibrant yellow inner bark. So if you were to cut it and see that yellow, that really helps kind of confirm the ID for this one. The thorns, so for a confusion species, there is an American barberry. It's not that common. So if you have barberry just randomly growing, it's probably Japanese barberry. The leaf looks a little bit different to me though. The big key will be the thorns. So Japanese barberry is going to have a single little spine versus a trident shape on the American barberry. There is a European barberry that is it's invasive as well. I've never seen it, so I don't think it really is around as much as it used to be. But same with American barberry. I actually never see this, but just keep an eye out. If it looks like it's barberry leaves, they have teeth to them, and then you see these three-pronged trident spines. You got something different. This is another one that can be dug out, but you want to get it early, well before seed sets. So you kind of need to get it by, really you needed to get it by this month. So it's a little late to dig it out. Definitely anytime you work with this, glove up, wear some thick, long sleeves too. Those needles hurt, and in my experience, they tend to break off. So they're a pain to get back out. This is another one though where cut stump and the basal bark application where the herbicide is being spread to the bottom of the shrub is effective throughout the year, including the dormant season. So the roots will take some of that up. This is one where I tend to see this and the next one in yards. They're already planted. Some people really like them, but if you want to have a replacement, there's plenty of native shrubs that have really great fall foliage, will grow to around the same height. Things like fragrant sumac has great fall colors, great habitat for wildlife. And red chokeberry, we've got beautiful fall colors, beautiful flowers, some really good fruit production from this one as well. This is not the one I thought was next, but multiflora rose is an invasive species. We are seeing those flowers right now. They are pretty. I will give it that. It does smell pretty nice. These flowers are basically blooming from about May to June. Got those nice 5 petals. The fruits show up in summer, but this was another one too. The fruits are, we call them rose hips. Those will persist over winter, so you still might see some of those around on shrubs right now. Tends to grow pretty scraggly. This shrub here is right outside our beechwood location. Nice little specimen of that shrubby growth, very dense shrub. For identification beyond the flowers, you can start looking at the leaves. So we do have compound leaves with the little leaflets. And roses in particular have this thing called a stipule. So at the base of the leaf, you do have this structure that looks like a wing. So if you have any roses in your garden, you can definitely take a look at this, or you have multifloral rose, you can try to look for the stipule. It's going to be right there at the bottom. And the way you can know for sure that you have multifloral rose versus a different one is multiflora rose has these fringes, these little tentacles or tendrils coming off of the stipule. So you're going to see that at the base of the multiflora rose stipule. And management wise, this is one where I have a lot of people will just say you can mow it over multiple. This is definitely in a situation where you just have a spot that you're trying to keep down. And you could try to mow this. You're gonna have to do it multiple times a year. You're gonna have to do it like I mean 6 times a year, and probably 2 to 4 years before the roots finally die out. But even then, any seeds that remained can also come back 20 years from now. So this is a very long-lived seed, and it's just gonna be very persistent. So this is another one too where cut stump, basal bark applications, very, very effective. You can also do a foliar spray that's got a pretty wide range for when you can spray the leaves. So I know we definitely want to minimize the herbicide use in any environment. So there are physical control methods. Just know that it's not going to be a one and done situation. Even the herbicide isn't necessarily going to be one and done. You do need to keep an eye out for this stuff. So if it's an area that you really, really want to protect and you really, really value the wildlife that is currently there, you can try some of these different methods. But if it's just you have patches that are just nothing but multiflora rose, try to focus on the other areas first. Really try to just promote the good habitat that you have. It's never going to be complete eradication. So don't drive yourself insane trying to mow this every year and go bankrupt trying to replace tires on a tractor as the little spines, the prickles pop it. Now, the next one, this is the other McDonald's shrub. So burning bush. This is one that is all the time, backyards, see them constantly in hedgerows, at fast food restaurants, in people's yards. They grows up pretty tall. This is another one that a lot of fall foliage uh, for this with that nice bright red. For identification, it is pretty easy because you do have this opposite growth like privet. However, it has these quirky wings that come off the side. So if you were to touch this, it'll break off. It'll just feel like a wafer thin piece of wood. And so you got opposite growth, quirky extensions. Not much you can confuse this with. Sweet gum is a native tree. When it's smaller, it tends to have a whole lot of quirky growth to it. And you could potentially confuse it with that, especially if for some reason it doesn't have the leaves. So if it's the winter time, sweet gum will have that five-pointed star-like leaf. But if for some reason the leaves aren't there, you can just notice that the corky growths are much more erratic, much thicker versus the wafer thin burning bush. Burning bush is in the genus Euonymus, and there is another Euonymus. Euonymus americanus is strawberry bush. Other people call it hearts of bustin. This is a native shrub to PA. It will not have those corky growths, so that's helpful for ID. And then the seed is completely different. So when it goes to fruit, strawberry bush, the native one, have these spiny porcupine hedgehog-like shell casings versus this thin outer casing for the burning bush. For management, you can try to pull out and dig, but man, you're going to have to cut and clip at it because it will come back. So again, most of these shrubs, it's going to be a cut stump application that I would recommend for the bigger ones. If you were to dig it out, you just need to keep an eye on it. This is all these little tiny seedlings here are burning bush that's trying to come back up from root fragments. So it does try to come back without any herbicide to keep it down. And up to this point, multiflora rose, definitely an edge habitat one, but a lot of these are shady plants. So you tend to see them in the edge habitat and then deeper into the woods. This next one I know at least one person in the audience is well familiar with this one. This is a full sun invader. So autumn olive, it is, if you've got a nice field that you're trying to convert into a meadow, this is the one that tries to ruin it for you. This will pop in and just constantly grow back out. So we've got flowers that are somewhat similar to privet. So they're the clusters of little white flowers that are going to be blooming in the springtime. If we zoom in though, the leaves will have it's like little silver speckles, and it's going to be on the top and the bottom, as well as the twig itself will be speckled. So it's just got a lot of speckling throughout it, including on the fruit. So it produces these fruits in late summer, and it will be very, very abundant. So there can be tons of these. But this is one of my favorite ingredients for a jam. So I know there's one website, I should have linked to it. I can't remember if it's still around, but there's one website where essentially this guy was trying to promote the way to control autumn olive is that we just need to eat it. So we just need to harvest the berries. We need to form it into jam. It's very tasty jam. The berries themselves are kind of tasty. The outer flesh is very sour, but it's pretty seedy. So very abundant seed production. And I think they're tasty, and unfortunately, so does wildlife. In fact, this is actually one of the reasons why, at least in the southeast, this plant was is pretty abundant because it was used in some wildlife management efforts because it was like, oh, look, it makes all these fruit and wildlife seem to love it. But it has all these other problems, like nothing eats the actual shrub itself. So it just runs rampant. There is a Russian olive, but it's going to look a little different. It's more pale berries, kind of has the silvery underside to the leaf. It's just as invasive. So either of these are not good to have around. This is another one where you can pull it out, you can dig it, but you probably know what I'm going to say next. Cut stump. This can be done year round. There is also a wide window for foliar spray of this. So digging it out is going to be something that you want to just keep an eye out for any resprouts on it. All right. So for the most part, when we talking about these shrubs, it is you could try to do physical control methods. You're just going to need to keep an eye on resprouts, and a cut stump is going to be one of the more effective methods. So the next one that we're going to be talking about is the one vine that I wanted to cover. So this is Oriental Bittersweet. We've got this nice little tendril coming off right here, just waiting for something to grab onto. So this is a twining vine that will just keep going up and up and up and thicken, and it's a big, thick, woody vine. These vines can climb up like 60 feet into the canopy. They're very, very brutal on the trees. The tree's trying to grow, but that twining vine's just not giving, it's unyielding, and so the tree essentially girdles itself as it's trying to grow out, push out that vine. Eventually the vine just kind of cuts off the living tissue right there, and this could cause the tree to die, not to mention just all that extra weight. Once this leaves out, it has tons of leaves, so it can shade out the tree that it's growing on, preventing it from getting any nutrients and killing the tree that way. So this can be a pretty problematic vine on a lot of trees. For identification, you've got this nice round leaf that has a little point. So it's like you got a bubble from a bubble gum, and you just kind of pull out that little tip. And also just the growth form is very good for ID. That twining vine that we saw in that first slide, just reaching out, waiting for its next victim, and just the dense foliage. The berries don't necessarily persist too long. They seem to fall off, or at least they get hidden by the leaves. But they're the red berries that have that white papery outer covering on it. So for management on this one, the first thing you need to do is try to get that tree free. Don't go out pulling on it. So instead, we do this method called the window cut. And that is where you would basically go up to the tree. If this was the bottom, you would cut at the bottom, so as close to the ground as you can, and then go up and cut to where you can reach. So if this was the bottom, cut here, then go up to like, I don't know, 3, 4 feet and cut again. The reason for the second cut is it will try to regrow from the bottom here. And if you just left this dangling, it can quickly grab back onto the old vine and grow right back up. It's got this speed run now of being able to get right back to the top. So cutting this window will kill all of this growth up here, and this will fall off. Don't pull on it. If you pull on it, it could hurt the tree. You could rip bark off the tree. You could rip branches off the tree. It could hurt you if this stuff falls. There's a lot of weight here. So just leave it after you do the window cut, and all that stuff will die. It will degrade off, and it will fall off on its own accord. Just cutting it and making sure that foliage can't come back out is going to help the tree immensely. But the big thing that like really kills this off is foliar spray. So that's where you're spraying herbicide directly on the leaf. That's what brings it down to the root system in this plant. Problem is when you have a vine growing 60 feet up into the canopy, all the leaves are up in the canopy. You can't get to the leaves. So one of the most effective ways is to come in, do this window cut, and then come back when that vine that you cut at the bottom starts to regrow and send out leaves. You can then come back and put just a little bit of foliar spray on the new leaves. This is again one that you want to follow the directions on when to apply this from the Penn State Extension or the DCNR, and what herbicides are best suited for this to limit the effect this would have on surrounding plants. All right, so we've discussed mostly woody plants, but I've got just a couple of herbaceous plants that I want to talk about. Poison hemlock. This is one that I get a lot of concerned citizens talking about this one. We've got a biennial. So the first year it exists as just a basal rosette of leaves. So just low to the ground. We got leaves that resemble ferns. So this nice lacy green foliage. Second year, it will shoot out a very tall stem. Then it gets these umbel flowers, so umbrella-like cluster of white flowers at the top. This can get confused with a lot of different things, which is problematic because it is poisonous. So trying to make sure to not touch this is a good thing. It's toxic if ingested. It can be lethal if ingested. Unfortunately, this looks a lot like wild carrot, and that's where some poisonings are involved with. It can also cause rashes, dermatitis on people that are sensitive, or if you handle this and break the stem and get the sap on you. Most members of this family will have a phototoxin in it. Tends to be contained deep in the sap, but the more you handle this stuff without proper gloves or proper PPE, you could get an increased chance of getting that rash. And again, lethal if ingested. So you really want to be safe around this. You want to know what to look for. So lacy leaves, white flower on the top. But the big thing for poison hemlock is if you look at the stem, it's going to be hairless. So you have this rounded hollow stem. So if it was to break, you'd see that it was hollow, no hair on it, and then purple splotches. These purple splotches can coalesce into just completely dark purple stem. Somewhere up on that stem, it's going to be very splotchy like this. So to me, this just looks diseased. This just looks like something I shouldn't be touching. But this will be present even in that first year of growth, might be hidden underneath the lacy leaves, but those purple splotches, hairless stem, sets it apart from other common lookalikes like false chervil. This is actually another invasive in the same way that the poison hemlock can be. So both of these will just easily shade out native plants. This one in particular, though, is a host for a virus that can target carrots and parsnips and celery. So if this stuff is growing near your garden, it could actually impact it. But it won't, it'll have similar flowers, it'll have similar leaves, but the hair, it'll have little tiny velvety hairs on like a ribbed stem. Another thing with the poison hemlock, if you were to crush this, it smells really bad. It's like a musty attic that probably had a lot of mice peeing in it. That's what it reminds me of. It's not a pleasant smell when poison hemlock's crushed. False chervil, not so much. And then the other look-alike is Queen's Anne's lace. This is listed as invasive in many states and even noxious. It's not listed in PA as far as I could tell. This is another one though that has that nice big white umbel of a flower and then a very, very hairy stem. So this is not going to be poison hemlock with that hairy stem. There's no purple blotching. And just a little bit of folklore. This gets its name. I don't know if you've ever noticed, if you've taken a look at Queen's Anne's lace, or some people just call it wild carrot. There is a single little flower structure right here that's kind of a maroon color. It's right there at the center, and the folklore is that Queen Anne was making lace, pricked her finger, and a drop of royal blood landed there, and so it persisted. So that's why we call this one Queen Anne's lace. There's actually some like confusion on why this is even here. There's been debate on, does this attract pollinators or actually does this deter predators or things? And one study did show that they had any of the flowers that had this seemed to have less galls from midges, so it seemed to deter the midges from landing on this. For management, definitely glove up. You want to wear gloves, long sleeves. If you're doing a lot of weed eating in an area that has poison hemlock, wear some eye protection too. This is something where, at the very least, you could, if it goes to seed, this can seed the area again. So you could clip the seed head into a thick black garbage bag, let that bake in the sun before just getting rid of it. There are some herbicides that are effective on the rosette. Penn State has done a pretty good article on this one. Do not burn this one though. Whatever you do, don't like pile this up, put it in a burn bin. For the record, this, if you haven't checked it out, the Joe Boggs, that's this death in a teacup photo right here, the Ohio State University. They call it the Buckeye Yard and Garden Online. It's a really great resource. He does an excellent job creating these articles on all sorts of different horticultural and garden questions. So highly recommend it. Again, it's Ohio State University's Buckeye Yard and Garden. Garlic mustard, we've got two more here. Garlic mustard is another biennial. So that first year, we've got these little rosettes of crescent moon like or kidney shaped leaves. If you were to crush this, it has that garlicky smell to it. The flowers are coming out right now. They're on these little four petaled white flowers on pretty long stems. Each one of these prongs is full of seeds. So as this dries out, these seeds will shatter, or the casing will shatter, sending seeds out everywhere. With this plant, if you were to just pull this out and leave it on a trail or leave it in the side of your yard, it has enough energy to produce more seeds from the existing flowers. So, and then as that thing dries out, these seed casings will shatter and it will expel those seeds out. So if you just leave this lying, this can just keep reseeding the area. So if you're thinking that, oh, I'm helping out by pulling some garlic mustard as I'm walking and leaving it on the trail, if no one picks that up, that garlic mustard will shoot out anyway. So, and now it's going to seed in that bare ground near the side of the trail if it wasn't already there. The only like native mustard, like closely related one is going to be toothworts. They'll have similar flowers, but the leaf is completely different. So we got that toothwort over here on the left versus the garlic mustard on the right. And for management, this is one, just pull it out, bag it up, and dispose of it. You can find recipes online if it's really fresh to turn into pesto or using the seeds as a garlic mustard. So there are fun ways to do that. And our final one might be surprising to some folks. So orange daylilies are not native plants and they can be invasive. So these are listed invasive in Pennsylvania. This is a very beautiful flower. It's actually, I think, one of my favorite to look at. It's a stunning flower. However, it will spread vegetatively through expansion of like thick tuberous roots that just really crowd out, not just above ground, but below ground, just allow nothing to establish. A lot of times this spreads when people are cleaning out their gardens. They're pulling out some of these lilies and just throwing them, or they pile it up near the edge of their yard. If there's a big rain event or something that causes some of those plants to go downstream, these can establish quickly in floodplain areas, taking over some of those sensitive areas. So this will spread pretty quickly and pretty badly. And I don't, you don't need to go out and like rip out everything that you have. For management on this, just if you really love these, consider containerizing them, so growing them in containers. If you do dig them up, just make sure to dispose of those plants properly. So these should be bagged up and disposed of, not just thrown out, because that root system could still be viable. If you do have a thick plot of this that you want to get rid of, you can try to smother it. The DCNR talks about this in their fact sheet, but you kind of mow down the area and then lay a sheet of black plastic over it. Just let it be for about a year, and then you can go back. So this is a plant that you can keep around, but just be aware that this is an invasive plant. So if you see it growing at the edge of your habitat, going into more natural areas, try to keep an eye on it. Herbicide is effective in fall. Smothering is a really good option for this one, though. All right, so that was all the ones that we were covering today. As you can see, there's only about like 7 minutes left. So I know the question is, but what about insert whichever invasive? There were about 140 different plants to choose from, and I had to cut like 5 when I first made this because I knew I wouldn't get to them all. So that is one thing where I can't stress enough that there are other resources out there. So just to reiterate, we do have the Penn State Extension, that Pennsylvania Department of Conservation and Natural Resource fact sheets. There's a website called invasive.org that is also highly useful. They will have tons of photos, so you can kind of look through different things for each of those species. You can see where they actually are invasive at. So invasive.org. And then finally, us. So if you have questions, reach out to me. My email will be here at the end. You also received an email from me this morning. So use me as a starting point. If I don't know the answer, I'll make sure to connect you with someone who does, or find you something that will answer that. So if you have questions, let me know. And I do want to talk briefly about some of the upcoming things. We do have an invasive species walk. This is actually being done at the Renzi Park Senior Center in McKeesport. So this is part of our Mon Valley initiative. And so if you want to see some invasive species with one of our naturalists as a guide, that's going to be happening on the 22nd of June. It's going to be a morning walk. And then also just a quick shout out, if you're looking for some volunteer opportunities, every Tuesday and Thursday, you can help us out at our Beechwood location. So Tuesday, we have some native plant nursery work sessions, and then we have just general gardening and landscaping support on Thursdays. This is another situation where if you're working with Roxanne or some of our land stewards or some of our other employees, you can ask to them. Some of the other volunteers, incredibly knowledgeable. So you can learn a lot just by coming out to volunteer with us for one day. But with that, I'm going to try to answer some of the questions that are in the chat. This was the presentation, so I hope that you all enjoy it. I'll stick around until I don't see anyone in here anymore, but if you have questions, you can reach me at cbh@aswp.org, or also nstallman@aswp.org. Either of them work. That is my direct line, so you can give me a call if you have any questions on that.